The candles in the dining room at Stonebridge Park had burned for 3 hours by the time Lady Constance Wentworth said it, her voice low and carrying that particular quality of dismissal that required no volume to wound. Cecily was at the sideboard, her back to the table, lifting the second wine decanter from its tray with the careful attention she gave to every task that required her hands to be occupied, while her ears remained free. She had learned in 3 years of service that this was the safest posture in a room, full of people who believed themselves unobserved by the help. "My dear Millicent," Lady Constance said to the Dowager Countess, her voice carrying the warmth of a woman entirely at ease, "you needn't concern yourself on that count. She is only a maid. She sees nothing." The Dowager laughed a short sound like a door pulled closed. Cecily set the decanter down without a tremor. It was at this moment that she became aware, with a precision she could not account for, that someone at the table was watching her. Not the way guests watched servants, with the peripheral distraction of a man noting a piece of furniture. This was a different quality of attention entirely. She did not turn to find its source. She had learned not to turn. She counted to 5, and moved to the next task, and the attention remained on her back like a hand held a careful inch above the skin, present and deliberate, and very still. Later, when she had returned to the passage and stood with her tray in the cold, she would allow herself to recall it. She would decide it was nothing. She was nearly certain she was wrong. She had arrived at Stonebridge Park in the first week of January, engaged as lady's maid to Lady Wentworth, a distant relation of the house, who had come to serve as companion to the Dowager Countess following the death of the previous Earl. The death itself had occurred in late October. After 6 weeks of what the household physician had recorded as a wasting fever of the lungs. The new Earl, Edmund Ravenswood, had arrived from London to take possession of the estate at the end of November, and by the time Cecily joined the household 2 months later, the grief in the great house had already calcified into something quieter and harder than grief. It sat in the rooms like cold air that no fire could entirely shift. She was the daughter of a country vicar who had died owing a modest debt and leaving behind 3 daughters and a library. Her 2 sisters had married young, both practically and without much difficulty. Cecily had not. She was not plain, though she was never the first thing a man looked at in a room, and she was not without feeling, though she had learned to keep the surface of her face as still and uninformative as paper. Her father had told her, in the last year of his life, when it was clear there would be no dowry and no particular prospects, that her mind was the only inheritance he could give her. He had meant it as comfort. She had taken it as instruction. She read. She observed. She filed away small discrepancies the way a careful woman files away thread ends for the day when they might be needed to close a seam. The first discrepancy that lodged in her attention at Stonebridge Park was the decanter, not the one she had lifted from the sideboard the evening of that dinner, a different one. Smaller, older, with a scratch across the base from some collision long ago. She had found it in the cellar passage when she was sent to fetch a bottle of claret the morning after her arrival, before she had learned the layout of the wine room well enough to go directly to the correct shelf. The decanter sat alone on a lower shelf, away from the numbered bottles, covered in a cloth that had not been disturbed in some time. The cloth itself was of no particular interest. What arrested her was the smell. Thin and faintly sweet present at the rim when she lifted the cloth to see what lay beneath, a smell she could not name, but could not dismiss. She had replaced the cloth. She had found the claret. She had carried it upstairs and said nothing, because she was, as Lady Constance had noted with such comfortable accuracy, only a maid, and maids who pointed at strange smells in the wine cellar were maids who found themselves dismissed before the week was out. She thought about the smell for 11 days before she did anything further. Mrs. Pender, the housekeeper, was a woman of 60, with a face like weathered stone, and a loyalty to the house that preceded the current Earl's birth by decades. She had managed Stonebridge Park through 3 deaths and 2 inheritances, and she had formed opinions of every person who had ever crossed the threshold that she shared with almost no one. She shared one with Cecily on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January, when Cecily came to the kitchen passage for her morning tray. and found Mrs. Pender already there, waiting. "You have been to the cellars twice since Monday," Pender said. She did not lower her voice because the kitchen passage at 6 in the morning was empty of anyone who might hear. "Lady Wentworth asked for a particular vintage," Cecily said. "Lady Wentworth, Mrs. Pender said. "Drinks whatever is brought to her, and has never once named a vintage in the 9 months I have known her." She looked at Cecily the way she might look at a problem she was not yet certain she wanted to solve. "Do not go back down there alone. May I ask why?" "No," Mrs. Pender said. "You may not. Take your tray." Cecily took her tray. She went back to the cellars the following morning. She was not there when the new Earl arrived at the library. She was not aware of him when she slipped inside the library at 5:30 on the morning of the 14th of February, carrying a single candle and wearing her plainest wool dress, the one she changed into before dawn on the mornings she intended to read before the household rose. The library at Stonebridge Park was a room she had identified in her first week as one of the places the house kept its better self. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and the books were not merely decorative. They had been read. Many had been read recently, their spines bent and soft in the way that only comes from repeated handling. She was looking for a specific volume. She had a name, copied from memory from a list she had glimpsed in the physician's notes left on the study table the week of the old Earl's death. The notes had been left out during a time when no one considered that a maid walking through to close the curtains might read. They had been incorrect to assume this. She found the volume on a middle shelf, a medical text from 30 years prior, and she had been standing at the reading table with it open for perhaps 15 minutes when she heard a footstep in the doorway. The Earl of Stonebridge was 34 years old and carried his height like a man who had long since stopped thinking about it. He was dark-haired, sharp at the jaw, and his face at 5:30 in the morning had the specific quality of a man who had not slept well in a very long time. He wore a dressing coat over his shirt and carried no candle of his own, which meant he had come from the direction of the east wing where there was still firelight enough to navigate the corridor. He saw her. She saw him. She closed the book and stood very straight, because the natural instinct was to shrink, and she had learned over 3 years that shrinking made things worse. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was level, and she could read nothing in it. "My lord," she said. He looked at the book under her arm. He looked at her face. He did not look at the time or at the candle or perform any of the small gestures a man uses to indicate that a servant has been found somewhere she should not be. "There's tea in the east sitting room," he said, "if you are cold." Then he crossed to the far end of the library, pulled a different volume from the shelf, and sat in the chair by the window as though she were not there. She stood for 3 full seconds, uncertain whether she had been dismissed or simply reclassified. Then she carried her borrowed book to the door and went quietly back upstairs. She did not return the book for 4 days. He did not ask for it. The household shifted in texture when Lady Isabel Fairfax arrived in the 3rd week of February, accompanied by her mother and a quantity of luggage that suggested an intention to stay well into the spring. The Dowager Countess received them in the blue drawing-room with the warmth she extended to very few people, and Cecily, attending Lady Wentworth through the formal reception, had the opportunity to observe the arrangements with the attention she gave to all things she did not yet understand. Lady Isabel was 24, and beautiful in the way that seemed calculated, her dark hair arranged with the precision of something practiced many mornings in front of a glass. She moved with the ease of a woman who had always been the correct answer to a question, and the dowager's hand on her arm as she guided her through the room had the proprietary satisfaction of a woman presenting a fait accompli. The Earl of Stonebridge greeted his guest with perfect courtesy and the absolute minimum of warmth required by that courtesy. He stood when she entered. He offered his hand. He said the things that were expected. And then he moved to the far side of the room, and Cecily noticed, because she noticed everything, that his hand went briefly to his breast pocket, in the gesture she had observed several times before, a checking movement, quick and unconscious, the way a man touches a letter he is not certain he is ready to read. She had seen him make this gesture the morning she found him in the library. She had seen it at dinner the previous Thursday. She had seen it in the entrance hall when the post was brought. Each time his hand went to his breast pocket, and then came away, and his face did not change. She filed this away with the other things she had filed. At dinner that evening, Lady Isabel was seated to the Earl's right, and the Dowager had arranged the table so that conversation flowed naturally toward the two of them. Cecily stood at the sideboard again, in the same position as the night Lady Constance had made her observation, and when the second course was brought in, and Lady Isabel turned to say something to her mother, she lowered her voice only slightly before continuing. "One needn't lower one's voice for a maid," Lady Isabel said, with the pleasant, matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a rule of nature. Several faces turned briefly toward Cecily. Most turned away again immediately. One did not. She felt it without looking for it, the same quality of attention from the head of the table, present and deliberate, and held past the point of social convenience. Then it released, and the Earl of Stonebridge lifted his glass and said something civil to Lady Isabel that drew the table's attention back to the center where it belonged. Cecily returned to the sideboard. She kept her face precisely as still as paper. She had, by this point, found the supply ledger. The wine cellar at Stonebridge Park maintained a handwritten record of every delivery and withdrawal, kept in a bound volume on the shelf beside the door. It was a mundane document, the kind of record that no one reads with attention, because it requires no attention. A list of dates and bottle counts, and the names of the merchants from whom the house purchased. Cecily had read it with the same care she gave to everything. And on the second reading, in the light of what she had found in the medical text, she had stopped at an entry dated the 6th of September. A delivery of 6 bottles of claret, recorded in a different hand from the usual. The merchant's name abbreviated in a way that matched no abbreviation in any previous entry. Against this delivery, a note in the margin for the Earl's particular use. The 6th of September was 7 weeks before the previous Earl had died. There were no other deliveries recorded in that different hand. There were no other entries noted as for the Earl's particular use. The 6 bottles appeared in no subsequent withdrawal record, which meant they had been consumed in the cellars or removed without notation. The small decanter with the scratch across its base and the sweetish smell at the rim sat on its low shelf undisturbed, a thing that no one had thought to look at. Cecily had looked at it. She had touched the rim with one finger, and then with a composure she was somewhat proud of. She had carried it upstairs, inside a linen basket, wrapped in a towel, and placed it in the back of the trunk under her bed. She would need to be certain before she said anything. She would need to be very certain indeed. It was on a cold Thursday morning in late February that she was in the still room comparing a page from the medical text against a passage she had transcribed by hand from the cellar ledger, when she heard the door behind her and turned to find the Earl of Stonebridge standing in the entrance. He was watching her with the face she had come to understand was not coldness, precisely, though it had all the external features of coldness. He looked at the papers in her hand. He looked at the book on the table. "Miss Marsh." "My lord," she said, and waited. He crossed the room. He did not ask for the papers. He stood close enough to read what she had written, and he read it. And she watched his face in the way she watched everything, and what she saw there was not the expression of a man surprised by what he was reading. It was the expression of a man who had suspected something for a long time without permitting himself the specific shape of the suspicion. "Come inside," he said. Not a request. The same level voice. "Not here." She followed him to the study at the east end of the corridor, and he closed the door, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The fire had been laid, but not lit. The room was cold. "Walk with me this afternoon," he said. "On the south grounds. At 3 o'clock. My lord, Lady Wentworth requires me at 3. I will speak to Lady Wentworth," he said. He left. She stood in the cold study for a moment, holding her papers, and then she went back to the still room and finished what she had been doing. She walked with him at 3 o'clock. He did not speak of the papers until they had reached the far end of the south lawn, where the ground sloped toward a stone wall and the afternoon light came low and gray across the grass. He walked with his hands behind his back, and his face turned toward the middle distance, and she walked at the correct social distance to his left, and waited. "How long have you known?" he said. "I do not yet know anything with certainty," she said. "I know what the supply ledger shows, and what the medical text describes, and what the smell at the rim of the decanter corresponds to, when those three things are placed beside one another." "And what does that correspondence indicate?" She told him in plain terms what she had worked out. She told him about the entry in the ledger in the different hand, and the notation for the Earl's particular use, and the 6 bottles that appeared in no subsequent record. She told him about the merchant's name that matched no established house in the county, and that corresponded, when she had checked the available records of such things in the estate's own correspondence files, to nothing. She told him about the medical text and what she had been looking for when she found it, and which symptoms described in that text bore a documented resemblance to what the physician's notes had recorded in the old Earl's final weeks. She told them about the decanter, and what she had done with it, and where it now was. He listened, without interrupting. His face remained still in the way she had come to recognize, not blankness, but the opposite of blankness. A face that was doing a great deal of work beneath its surface, and had learned to do it without advertising itself. She watched his jaw and his hands, because those were the places the stillness sometimes broke at its edges, and she saw what she saw there, and she did not name it aloud. When she had finished, he did not speak immediately. He looked at the stone wall at the end of the south lawn, and the light across the grass, and then he said, "My brother wrote me a letter. He stopped walking." She stopped beside him, and they stood at a proper social distance on the brown winter grass, and his voice was as level as she had ever heard it. "In October I received it the day before I received word of his death. I believed it was a summons about the estate management. We had corresponded about the estate all autumn. I did not open it." She waited. "I have not yet opened it," he said. She understood, then, why his hand went to his breast pocket in those quick, checking gestures. She understood the particular quality of grief that lives not in what is lost, but in what was left undone when there was still time to do it. Her father had left letters unwritten. She knew what it was to carry the weight of a message that had not been exchanged when it should have been. He reached into his pocket. He took out the letter. The paper was soft at the folds with handling, many months of being carried against his chest without being opened. He stood in the cold afternoon light with the page in his hand, and she looked away, because whatever was inside that letter was not hers to witness, and because she understood that he had come to the south lawn today with the specific intention of being somewhere private enough to finally read it. She heard the paper open. She heard him read. She heard nothing after that for a very long time. A crow flew over the far end of the grounds, and the light shifted a little on the stone wall, and the grass bent briefly in a thin wind that came and went. "Free words," he said at last. "There is something wrong with the wine." His voice was entirely level. She understood that the levelness was the only thing holding the rest of it in place, and she did not press. "If you have remained with this story until now, leave a word in the quiet below when you are ready. Some things are worth witnessing." They stood together at the edge of the south lawn as the light failed, and then he turned and they walked back to the house, and she told him the rest of what she knew, and he listened to all of it. He did not tell her that day what he intended to do. She thought she understood him well enough by now to trust that he intended something. Lady Constance had not survived 3 decades of Regency society by being careless. She was not careless now. Whatever had alerted her to Cecily's investigation, whether it was a missing page from the still-room records, or a question she had overheard from one of the footmen about the cellar ledger, or simply the animal alertness of a person who has done something that cannot be undone and has spent 3 months waiting for consequences. She acted swiftly and with characteristic control. On the evening of the 1st of March, she requested a private audience with the Dowager Countess Cecily, who was not present. She did not need to be. Mrs. Blank. Pender came to her room at 9:30 with a face that said everything before she opened her mouth. "The Dowager has spoken to his lordship," she said. "She has told him that you have been interfering in matters outside your station. that you have been reading the household records and conducting some manner of private inquiry into the circumstances of the previous Earl's death." Cecily said nothing. "His lordship has been told, Mrs. Prox," Pender continued, "that you are to be dismissed by the end of the week." She paused. The pause was weighted with something Cecily could not fully read. The dowager said to him, "I am told that you are only a maid," and that he could not credit what a maid says against a gentlewoman of Lady Constance's standing. Cecily sat very still on the edge of her bed. She thought of the look on his face when he read the 3 words his dead brother had written. She thought of his voice in the still room, entirely level, telling her to come inside. She thought of his hand at his breast pocket, months of not opening a letter because there was a cost to opening it that he had not yet been able to pay. She had thought he was different from the others. She had thought, with the particular quiet certainty of a person who has spent 3 years learning to read people at their unguarded edges, that he saw her, not as a maid, and not as a curiosity, and not as a piece of the furniture, but as the specific person who had been in the still room with the papers and the medical text and the knowledge of what the smell at the rim of a decanter meant. The cold that settled in her chest was not quite grief and not quite surprise. It was the feeling of a woman who has been told one more time the thing she has been told her whole life, that the intelligence her father left her was no inheritance at all, that it belonged to her in private and could not be used in public without consequence, that a maid who sees things is still only a maid. She did not cry. She had learned not to. She sat on the edge of her bed in the small, cold room above the east passage, and she looked at the window, and the window showed her nothing but the dark of a March evening and her own faint reflection in the glass. A woman in a plain dress with her hands in her lap, very still. She thought of the morning in the library and the way he had not reported her. She thought of the still room and his face above her papers. She thought of the south lawn and 3 words on a folded page, and the crow, and the light. She had spent her life learning that people could surprise you. She had spent an equal part of it learning that people could also do exactly what everyone expected them to do from the beginning. She was not certain yet which of these was true. She began, methodically, to decide what to pack. The formal dinner that the Earl of Stonebridge announced for the 10th of March was unusual in several particulars. The invitations were sent not only to the guests already resident in the house, which would have been social enough, but to 3 men from outside the estate. Their names were provided to the butler the morning after the announcement. Mr. Calder Swain, the Stonebridge family solicitor, a man whose connection to the estate was professional rather than social, and whose presence at a dinner was therefore unexpected, a physician from the county town, and a magistrate, Sir Frederick Honeywell, who had served the district for 30 years, and who was, by reputation, nearly impossible to impress. None of this was known to Lady Constance when she dressed for dinner on the 10th of March and took her place at the table, in the full confidence of a woman who has neutralized a threat and is waiting for the social mechanics to finish the work she has set in motion. The dining room at Stonebridge Park held a table of 20. That evening it held 14, which meant there was room enough for each face to be clearly visible to every other. The dowager sat at her customary position. Lady Isabel was to the Earl's right, as she had been arranged for weeks. Lady Constance held a center position as befit a woman of her standing in the household. The 3 men from outside the estate were placed with the careful social attention that placed them at a remove from the family, but within full view of everyone present. Cecily was not at the sideboard. She had been told 3 days before by Mrs. Pender that she was to remain in her room and await further instruction. She had waited. On the evening of the 10th, she sat in her room with the decanter wrapped in its towel on the bed before her, and the supply ledger transcription in her hand, and she did not know what she was waiting for. The footman came for her at 8:30. He knocked. He said that his lordship had requested her presence in the dining room and that she was to bring what she had with her. She carried the decanter. She carried the transcription. She walked down 2 flights of stairs and through the passage and through the door that the footman held open, and into the dining room where 14 people turned to look at her. She stood very straight. The Earl stood at the head of the table. He had not sat down when she entered, which meant he had been standing already, and the room's attention had been on him before she arrived. He looked at her with an expression that was not warmth. Precisely, but that was the closest thing to warmth she had seen on his face in all the weeks she had observed it, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Marsh. If you would place those items on the table?" She set the decanter down. She set the transcription down. She stepped back. Mr. Swain, the solicitor, rose from his seat. He had papers of his own. "Way," he began, in the measured voice of a man accustomed to legal recitation. To speak, he spoke about the supply ledger. He spoke about the chemical analysis that had been conducted on samples taken from the small decanter by the county physician over the course of the past week, analysis that had been arranged and authorized by the Earl without the knowledge of any other member of the household. He spoke about the specific compound identified. He spoke about its properties, its effects over the course of weeks at small doses, and the medical literature that described those effects, in terms that bore a documented correspondence to the symptoms recorded in the late Earl's physician's notes. The room was very quiet. Lady Constance's face had gone still in the particular way that a face goes still when the body has understood something that the mind is not yet ready to admit. Mr. Blank. Swain spoke about the delivery recorded on the 6th of September. He spoke about the hand in which it was recorded, and the name of the merchant, which had been traced to no established wine merchant in the country, and whose abbreviated form corresponded to a notation found in Lady Constance's own household accounts from the previous autumn. The dowager said, "Edmund, it was a single syllable full of the objection of a woman whose world is being rearranged without her consent." Edmund looked at her, not unkindly, with the patience of a man who has already decided what will happen next, and is prepared to wait for the room to catch up with him. Then he looked at Cecily. The dowager tried again. "She is only a maid, Edmund. She cannot be permitted to—" And here her voice faltered, because the solicitor had placed a document on the table that stopped her. Edmund said, "Miss Marsh saw what none of us dared to see." The room held the silence that follows a thing that cannot be unsaid. Lady Constance rose from her chair. The motion was controlled. The exit was controlled. She moved to the door with the dignity of a woman who knows that the remaining option is dignity. And she left the dining room, and the door closed behind her. Sir Frederick Honeywell, who had been silent throughout, set down his wine-glass. He looked at the decanter. He looked at the document Mr. Swain had placed on the table. He nodded once, with the specific gravity of a man performing a function rather than rendering a personal judgment, and said, "I will call tomorrow morning." The room began to breathe again. Cecily stood at the edge of the table with her hands folded and her face entirely still, and felt, beneath the stillness, the particular sensation of a floor that has been solid all along, but that she has only just been permitted to stand on. The house was quiet by 11:30. The guests had retired. The dowager had not appeared again after dinner. Lady Isabel's mother had made quiet inquiries about the logistics of departure the following morning, which Mrs. Sandrashi Pender had handled with the serene efficiency of long practice. The footman had cleared the dining room. The fire had been banked in the ground floor rooms and the candles extinguished, and the great house of Stonebridge Park settled into the particular hush of a place that has been holding its breath for 6 months and has at last been permitted to release it. Cecily was in the library. She had gone there without planning to. The way one goes to a room that has become, over weeks of visiting it at unusual hours, something close to a home. She was not reading. She sat in the chair at the far end of the room with a candle, and nothing in her hands, and she thought about her father and his library, and the 3 daughters he had left, with nothing but the instruction to use what they had. She thought she had used it. She thought the cost of using it was not yet entirely clear to her. She heard the door. She did not look up immediately. She knew from the sound of the step who it was. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment in the near dark at the room's entrance, and then he crossed to the chair across from hers and sat. He did not speak immediately. Neither did she. They had spent enough time in rooms together that the silence between them was not an absence of things to say, but a room in itself, a place where things could exist before they were required to be spoken. Cecily, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it the way he said all important things, quietly, and with the fullness of intention behind it. And she felt the name settle in the air between them with the weight of something deliberate. She looked at him. "You are not leaving," he said. "I need you to understand that. My position in this household," she began, "will change," he said. "Yes, I have been thinking since October about what is appropriate. I have been thinking since the morning I found you in this room with a medical text and a composure that I could not account for, about what it is I have been trying not to see." She waited. She was very good at waiting. "I have not been good at it," he said. "Not seeing what I wish to. I am told it is a family quality." Something in her chest eased very slightly, with the quality of a knot that has not been released, but has been given a little slack. "There is a position," he said, "for a person of intelligence and discretion in the management of this estate, not as a maid." He paused. "The position would require some renegotiation of the social arrangements. There would be discussion." "There would be a great deal of discussion," she said. "Yes," he said. "I expect so." He leaned forward in his chair, and the candle between them lit the planes of his face from below. She understood that he was not speaking about an administrative position, and that he had not been speaking about it for some time. And that the quality of attention she had felt on her back at the sideboard, the first evening she arrived at Stonebridge Park, had always been this, and that the only person in the room who had not seen it was herself. His hand was on the arm of his chair, very near to hers, where her hand rested at the edge. He did not reach for it. He looked at her with the steady attention of a man who is accustomed to waiting for the correct moment, and is not entirely certain this is it. "You are cold," he said. "I am not particularly," she said. His hand moved, very slightly, and she met him halfway, and his fingers closed over hers with the specific warmth of something long withheld. They sat like that in the candlelight for a long time, the fire in the grate burning low, neither of them speaking, and outside the library windows the first light snow of the season had begun to fall against the glass, quiet and fine and entirely indifferent to the arrangements of the house below. When he kissed her, it was brief and full of what it contained, and she understood that it was the beginning of a conversation that would take them a very long time to finish. She found she was not in any particular hurry. The following spring was a mild one, which was noted by everyone in the district as unusual enough to bear remark, and Stonebridge Park opened its windows to it with what Mrs. Porty Pender described to her niece in a letter as an air of considerable improvement. Cecily had been appointed, in the formal arrangements that Mr. G. Swain had drafted with his customary precision, to the position of private secretary to the Earl of Stonebridge, a title that carried with it a salary, and a set of rooms in the East Wing, and a legal standing that she had spent 3 years not expecting to have. The arrangement had occasioned exactly as much discussion as she had predicted it would, and the discussion had resolved itself in the way that all discussions resolve, when the person at the head of the relevant estate is both determined and in possession of a solicitor willing to document the basis of his decisions. Lady Constance Wentworth had withdrawn to an address in Yorkshire that no one at Stonebridge Park named aloud. Sir Frederick Honeywell's morning call had lasted 2 hours, and had resulted in a further process that Cecily had observed only in its administrative periphery, which was as close as she wished to come. The Dowager Countess had said very little about any of it, which was its own form of acknowledgment. She had accepted Cecily's presence in the house with the specific silence of a woman who has reassessed the terms available to her and chosen the most dignified of them. Lady Isabel had returned to London. On a morning in April, with the study windows open to the garden and the new green of the grounds visible all the way to the stone wall at the south end, Edmund sat at his desk with his morning correspondence, and Cecily sat at the writing table she had been given along the opposite wall, working through the estate accounts with the attention she gave to all things she had been trusted to do. She was aware of him in the room, the way she had always been aware of him, not as a distraction but as a specific gravity, a thing around which the air arranged itself differently. Mrs. Pender came in at 10 with the tea tray and set it on the table and looked at the two of them with the face of a woman who has been proved correct about something she has known for a long time and is too dignified to mention it. "Thank you, Mrs. Pender," Cecily said. "Miss Marsh," said Mrs. Pender, and went back out. Edmund rose from his desk. He crossed to the writing table and set before her, without preamble, a folded piece of paper. She looked at it. She looked at him. "My brother's letter," he said. "I have been keeping it in my pocket for 6 months, and it does not belong there any more." She took it from him. He returned to his desk. She set it on the edge of her own table beside the inkwell where it would stay. She decided as long as it needed to. She returned to the accounts. He returned to his correspondence. The spring light came through the open window and lay warm across the floor of the room, and outside in the garden a thrush was doing something emphatic in the rose bushes, and the estate of Stonebridge Park continued about its mourning in the patient accumulative way of a house that has, at last, been given back its own right weather. At some point in the middle of the morning, without looking up from his letters, Edmund reached across the narrow distance between their tables and placed his hand over hers where it rested beside the inkwell. She let him. His brother's letter lay between the teacups and the open window, folded and still, and finally sat down, and the spring went on outside without any further instruction from anyone.